They have one at the area lab.
Augmented reality. So like I could be like looking at this room and I could change, you know, the looks of everyone that's sitting here, right? I could say, make them all ancient Greeks. And you'd all be sitting here in togas, I guess. And yet I'd be looking at you. Is that right? I haven't tried it yet. So I'm interested in trying it.
It's kind of like if I'm looking at you, I can, if there's like an app or something, you can pull up a whole different being like right next to you, and it seems like it's a part of it.
So it's going to get even more confusing. It's an active change that's taking place in our society right now. And Chalmers is trying to deal with it and trying to understand what's the difference between reality and virtual reality, when virtual reality is actually our reality. Why? Because if my phenomenal experience includes a mixture of these, that's my reality, right? So how do we discuss this?
Getting into some Baudrillard there.
Pardon?
Getting into some Baudrillard there. Baudrillard. A little bit.
Yeah, I suppose. I confess, have I ever read any of him? Probably not. Seems to me it's difficult and boring. Is that right?
That's what I've heard.
I think, yeah.
The later his books, the more incomprehensible they are.
I tried Proust, and I thought, what the hell is the interest in this guy? It's really boring. I mean, he spends like 100 pages talking about the fly on the table, I mean, flies are interesting, but mostly because you want to kill them, not because you want to watch. And I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say that. He was French, though. French Swiss. I don't know. I know that the Proust house is one of the places where more tourists visit than practically Rome. I don't know, and I don't know why. But David Chalmers is interesting. Interesting videos talking about contemporary things. And we've got also the Churchlands. Who's a philosopher mostly working with consciousness. And her husband, what's her husband's name? Anybody know? Paul, thank you. And I don't know, I think the two of them work together quite a lot. So I'm not really sure what the difference is between their thinking. They might be both together. Our brains are very similar in organization, neuronal, etc., etc. So those folks are fascinating. He's fascinating. There's tons of folks. This is fascinating. James is going to take this psychology, and by the way, remember his father was very much involved with Swedenborgian religion and religion in general, and dealing with the depth of despair and how do you survive it. James had many such experiences, and I think Kay Redfield is probably right that he had bipolar disease or that condition because he's does great at the beginning of the year. He's teaching a great course, but by March he's had it. He's spent, and then he's got to recover. It seems almost like this regular pattern of having an emotional high and just producing an entire book of the varieties of the religious experience. What are those, and why is that so important? And by the way, when I was at the new church in Bryn Athyn, they had a museum that was gathered by the owner of the mansion that was on the same campus. By the way, they also have a university there, and you don't have to be Swedenborgian to go. But it's pretty clear to me that the whole time you're there, they're doing their best to convince you to switch. That's one of those things. But the museum they have is all these religious not monuments, but religious artifacts that the owner of the mansion collected in Egypt, different religious things from the ancient Egyptians and from the Babylonians and all different kinds of art, because that's their interest. How did people deal with meta-narration? How did religion play a role in our consciousness and our evolution, if you think of it this way, right? And for James, religion is an absolutely essential matter for our psychological health. So when he goes and gives a lecture in response to Josiah Royce, who, by the way, was his neighbor in Cambridge, their houses were brand new houses that they both built together, the same construction company, etc., and they both look the same on Irving Street. And you've got the one house and the other, and they would walk to school together and argue with one another because they were great friends, but at the same time they disagreed on everything. And Josiah Royce, show you him too.
Makes me wonder if he influenced Carl Jung, because I know Carl Jung in a lot of his essays.
Oh,
and lectures.
James?
Oh yeah, I wonder if he.
Yes,
influenced
James,
Carl.
absolutely. Royce, I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, not Royce. I'm referring to yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Because Carl Jung would talk about and do a lot of research into various local religions and all that, and how religion and sort of the philosophical development of people affected psychological development. So in his mind, the Eastern mindset is psychologically fundamentally different than the Western mindset. So you have to bridge that gap, but if you try to as a pure Westerner without completely different philosophical and historical context, try to properly integrate that Eastern line of thought, you're either just going to get a really superficial version or just go crazy. Because you would talk about stories of Christian missionaries trying to learn all these various tantric and Hindu rituals to understand, that help convert them. And during these rituals, they would literally go crazy. They would lose their minds.
The James family were all very familiar with other religions. In fact, the varieties of the religious experience that James will write in response to his Edinburgh lecture, the Gifford Lectures. Josiah Royce was, I think, the first American to give the Gifford Lectures, and James was the second. The Gifford Lectures are focused on religion and philosophy. I should show you who's currently there, because practically the whole list of philosophers I have given the Gifford Lectures. I think I mentioned that Bruno gave them. Oh, stop it. Get away. Sure. Oh, I don't want to see those. Okay. Thanks. So every year they select a new speaker, and you can look at the list. The list includes Bruno Latour, I mentioned, Daniel Dennett has given, yes?
That's mine.
Yes, there you go. He's given the lecture. And by the way, they're online, so you can watch the YouTube lectures for them as well. But the very first American, as I understand it, was Josiah Royce, who was invited. And so that's quite an honor for an American philosopher to be invited to a European university to give such a lecture. And by the way, James loved Edinburgh. He thought Edinburgh was the best human city ever, of all the cities he knew. Yeah. But Josiah Royce Well, now let me talk about this a little bit to try to explain part of the puzzle, because James was against those in Harvard that were pro-Hegel. And Royce was part of that group, so he was pro-Hegel. And if you read James in criticizing them, which he did quite often, he made fun of them actually. He thought that the problem with their thinking was that with this dialectical process of Hegel, you end up with this thesis, going against this antithesis, and then you get the new thesis, and then you get and then it keeps going. And what happens is what happens. And you basically, in the view of those Hegelians in the Harvard community, interpreted that to mean that whatever happens is what God basically planned. Whether you called it God or the absolute, or you thought of it the way Hegel did as the advance of freedom of consciousness, constantly becoming greater and greater. The ancient Chinese only thought one person could be free, and that was the emperor. Then the Romans and the Greeks thought lots of people could be free because they were more of a republic or a democracy. And then with Hegel, you get the idea that everybody can be free. You just have to have the right education so that you can have kind of that, he didn't call it this, but the Übermensch mentality, right? But what that does, James thought, was give you a sense of sterility. There's nothing especially that you ought to be doing then. Because if everything that's happening is happening the way nature is meant to happen, then what are we supposed to do in order to help direct the changes that go forth? So he was against the Hegelians in his community that were interpreting Hegel that way. The author that I really became familiar with Hegel was Walter Kaufmann, who I think I mentioned once. Walter Kaufmann talks about William James and says William James criticized the Hegelians of his day, but he was actually closer to Hegel than they were. So when I read James, I'm thinking from Kaufmann's point of view, James's criticisms are laudable, but he doesn't understand that that's not really what Hegel was talking about. And I think one example of it is when James criticizes them, he says, if something is true, the false remains that way. In other words, the truth remains the truth all the time, and the false doesn't merge with it and end up creating a new status, of half true, half false. He thinks it's a contradiction. Contradictions can't be merged and create a new situation. It'd be like looking, in world political system, like looking at the conflict between Israel and the Hamas. What are they doing? It looks like it's just absolutely incredibly hopeless. There's no way you could end up with some sort of merger between these two points of view that could end up resulting in a new, a situation. It's absolutely amazing. I don't know if you were following the news on this regard or not, but there was one Israeli whose a sibling had been kidnapped, and he's still hoping that that person will be released so that he'll be able to see him again, because he's apparently alive as far as he knows. So he's hoping to see his sibling back again. And he was absolutely amazed and full of hope, knowing that Israel and Hamas are actually in negotiations. He couldn't believe that that was even possible. But obviously, the work of people like President Biden and the Qatar diplomats and I guess the Egyptians and all the ones that are involved in this actually, figured out a way to get them to at least obviously come to an agreement on certain things. And for 4 days now so far, they've had a ceasefire with people being transferred and so on, right? That strikes me as as the kind of conflict that you're talking about here. How can this be resolved in a way that there could be a future? And if you think of it, if they can actually figure out some way of both of those societies cooperating with one another in the future, that will be absolutely amazing. But yeah, as far as James is concerned, it's a contradiction. You can't have that. That's not something that Hegel is right in thinking, that there is no true